Welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at the KZ EDA. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the EDA is actually a trio of sets. Each one has its own slightly unique tuning, and they package all three in one box at one price. So you're essentially buying maybe three $10 ED series sets, all boxed in one single package with one cable and lots of tips. So a little bit unique. You don't really see this too often. I'm not sure anyone's really packaged three whole IEMs in one box, but it's not like they're saving you a ton of money. They're essentially charging you for three $10 sets at $30 or so, whatever the retail price is going to be. So that's the short story. What does it look like up close? We'll take a look at this one. So this is sort of an ED level shell. It's kind of your basic plastic shell. There's a big dynamic driver in there, which is one of their newer style, ultra thin, very similar to maybe a CRA style driver. Not entirely sure it's different from the CRA driver. I think it's quite similar, and it's definitely in the ultra thin series. So one thing that you will notice, let's see if I could actually find the pair. So one thing you will notice is that they do have some tuning methods for each one. So this one is sort of a normal metal grill in the nozzle. This one definitely has some kind of tuning filter on it. So I think they clearly did intend to give you three different tunings. So what do they look like on the graph? And I would say that this set works a little better for hobbyists as opposed to maybe someone looking to get into a trio as their first three IEMs and sort of wanting to experience maybe a bass, neutral, higher treble set. These are sort of variations on, I would call it CRA-like. So not quite CRA tuning, but I think there's some DNA there, and they gave you variations as opposed to what a standard bass, treble, and neutral would actually sound like. So they call them bass, balanced, and high res. So bass is clearly the one that actually has lots of bass. The balance I would call the most CRA-like. So it's more of a CRA, but brought down, not into the mega treble area. So if you had problems with the CRA, balanced is one that is going to be a little more likable to your ears. And high res, and I would say that if you actually just look at it, it is not the one with the most treble. So I think high res was the right word for it. High res actually does sort of cut through the middle on a couple of these peaks, so I think that is an appropriate name. But generally, when you look at all three, they're kind of similar, and that's why I say, as an entry-level set, I'm not sure it works. For a hobbyist who wants to experience and understand what these signatures sound like and how these peaks affect their own, perception of music, I actually think it actually works quite well for the hobbyist. And because generally you can kind of see the signature, they both have quite a lot of this mid bass. It's quite elevated, so you kind of get a similar feel, especially through the bass. The bass has a little more, very similar mids, and then how the lower treble affects your mids and detail and resolution, all those things. I think that those are things that are very much interesting to the hobbyist, whereas the entry-level person who is trying IEMs for the first time may think that they all sound quite similar. So, like I said, I think the hobbyist will get a kick out of hearing slight variations on the same driver with different tunings. I think that's a very cool idea. But as far as someone looking to get into IEMs for the first time, these may be a little too similar for them. So do take that into consideration. So let's kind of run through lots of words here. And we'll start with some of the commonalities between the sets. And like I said, despite graphing kind of similar, if you're a hobbyist and you're used to hearing IEMs, I think each set does reflect a name. Certainly the bass one certainly does reflect the bass, and the high res I think is actually an appropriate name. So I think they got that part right. The core of the driver, or the core of it, is a driver that's either the same or similar to CRA, retuned away from that mega treble CRA sound, and is less fatiguing to me. So if you had tried CRA and found it wicked fatiguing, kind of like I do, if you raise that one at some higher volumes, it's actually, it can hit the peaks really bad for me. So that wasn't really my favorite set. This one is a little more likable, a little more easier to listen to than CRA for me. So, but it did, like I said, it actually moved a little bit away from the mega trebles, but that gives you a less fatiguing sound. And like I said, all three do have this elevated bass and some form of 5K peakiness and 8K sibilance. And you can kind of see that here. Not here, that's 2.5-ish, but the way these sets sort of mirror not all that far from my signature, that's pretty reasonable. That's Harmon-ish kind of rise right there. If it was over here, it would be even better, but the way they peaked a little bit right here on 5, that's going to hit some people in the wrong spot, like me. Two of these sets hit me in the wrong spot. One of them is a little better. And then this 8K does have a little extra energy there, and you will hear that in some sibilance on some higher female voices. And the extension through the treble is actually fine, but do be aware that these aren't sort of top-of-the-line tuning where, there is some peakiness there that you really can't ignore. So let's talk about the bass set. The bass set, I think, is actually this guy. Hopefully, maybe I got that wrong. Maybe I did not. Green is the good one, so that's the only one I actually remember. But so looks the same, just clear. So the bass set, definitely my least favorite, and is really for folks who prefer lots of bass, and that is their priority. But you always have to keep in mind that a heavy bass set can still be well tuned, and this one is kind of okay, and I'll kind of show you where this one hits me in the wrong spot. So the bass set, most bass here, 2 peaks right here. It actually peaked out the highest in these 2 areas. Odd, and I don't know if they were just compensating, that was the tuning, that's what they could do. Either way, you end up with a lot of bass, so if you have a lot of bass and you want to turn it up, cool, you get lots of nice pounding bass because you can turn it up a little bit, and then you start hearing this, and then that turned me off. So did I spend hardly any time with the bass? No, because it was kind of more fatiguing than the other two, and it just wasn't really a well-tuned heavy bass set to me. So the balanced, the gold guy, so kind of a nice looking set, and I will say that this one is what I would say the closest to the CRA sound. It's a variation of the CRA tuning, and it still leans a bit bright, much like CRA. I would say that one leans bright as well, so I wouldn't call it super balanced. I will call it still leans bright. What I will say is it balances a lot of good things that happened in this side of the curve here from the bass into the mids, and it balanced it out with some peakiness here, and that's the part that I didn't really care too much about. So there's a lot of kind of half good things and half things I don't like about the balance. So it was a balance between the good and the bad for me. But this one is the closest to something that I would call a rebalanced, less fatiguing CRA. The bass is still a hair too much. It's kind of a little hard to nitpick it at this price. The mids, sort of like the CRA, can be a bit thin, but for me, they always sound a little bit more natural on the balance set just because of the peaks that I hear on CRA. Other people are definitely going to have a different opinion on that, but in general, it does have that CRA speed, and then there's really aggressive sound to it that can sound very detailed, but when you really listen to it closely, a lot of the really small details have gone away. I said the same thing about CRA. Kind of at the high level, it sounds sharp and detailed. At the really small detail level, lots of things disappeared. So the difference between the detailed playback, and that's what I would call CRA, it had this really detailed playback, but did it ever really fool you into thinking that you're there in the room with that vocalist? And that's, I think, where CRA kind of fell down. A lot of those small details where you hear the reverbs and the acoustics or sort of the atmosphere of the room, those things never translated well on CRA, but at the high level it did detail pretty well because it was so sharp, but it never really convinced me that I was in the room as that you will find on more expensive sets. So that was one of my nitpicks from the original CRA that carries through on the balanced treble. Again, I will say it's less fatiguing than CRA. It's kind of similar. It just doesn't have that mega treble level that CRA have, but a lot of the same peakiness at high volumes. I would even say balanced is a medium volume set as well. You may get more detail. I could probably get more detail out of it if I listen to it at higher volume, but it just becomes too fatiguing for me. The stage is actually quite interesting on EDA Balanced. It has this kind of big, tall, and wide. It's not really, it's still kind of flat, doesn't have a whole lot of depth to it, but it's sort of engaging, and it is, I would say, it sort of borders on an experience. You don't, in a $10 set, I think it actually does quite well. If you're expecting a lot of depth, maybe not, but how big it is, how wide it is, and tall it is. It's kind of cool. I have to admit that I thought they did a semi decent job on the stage on that set, as well as some of the recent KZs as well. I think they've been sort of hacking away at the stage problem and making them bigger and wider, and I think Balanced is yet another step in that good direction. So I do think that the Balance set, I think people, at least the initial feedback on Balance, people tend to like that set, and I think that is one of the reasons that it sounds a little more expensive than it is, simply because you're hearing a stage that would kind of represent a more expensive set. I think they did a pretty good job there. So the high-res Lucky Green set is my favorite, and these are the tips that I use. These are KB07 tips. I don't use the stock tips because it's a little peaky, and I think the KB07 did a little better job. But yeah, I do think out of the trio, the Lucky Green here is the best set. Definitely my favorite set. I think it's the star of the trio to me. And like I said, high res does not mean more treble. When you look at the graph, it doesn't even show up on the graph as the most treble. It's sort of down in the 2.5 area, so it's a little less shouty, but a little more energy than Balanced, which is what I liked. And I think generally the balance here just worked for me, whereas this is a little low, this is a little high, this is a little high. The whole thing is just shifted a little bit like CRA was, whereas this, when you turn it up and you get that Fletcher-Munson effect of things rising at different rates, I think for me personally, high res just worked a lot better in this situation. Hard to figure out looking at the graph why that all worked out that way, but I will say the high res does sound a little more resolving, more resolution, smaller details, the reverb, all those things you can sort of get to hear at a $10 set, which is kind of cool. And like I said, something about that increased gain area sounds more balanced to me. It's less fatiguing at high volume. It just works for me personally. Will anyone else agree with that? Not really sure, but definitely for me, high res is a different set than Balanced, and much easier to listen to for longer sessions. The bass, again, just generally elevated. It is a hair less than the other two, but if you're looking for a traditional treble, trio set where the treble is bumped and the bass is dropped, that's not really what they did here. You can kind of see the bass level in the red is pretty much the same as Balanced, and the treble level is just a little different. So that's why I said, as an entry-level set, the high res, where people would expecting a treble set, it's not that. Is the high res a better set than a traditional treble boosted set? Probably, for me anyway. But yeah, so especially in the bass, I don't think it's CRA level technicalities because that's stretched pretty far. But I think it's just easier to like is what I would call it. And I think the level and detail is kind of appropriate for the tuning. This one, the bass actually does fit right well with the mids. There's not like a big gap there between KZ's traditional booming bass and the mids. These two are actually fit kind of well together, so I don't have too many nitpicks on the bass. I think that was kind of fine. Again, the mids are going to be a hair thin due to that 5K, especially if you're sensitive to it. This whole thing right here tends to thin out what happens here, and typically happens for me, and I think it happens here. But in the grand scheme of KZ sets, I think they actually did a pretty decent job. I think it sounds a little off, a hair not as natural as it should, but yeah, I think high res did a pretty good job, the best job out of the three, especially on the mids. And with a tiny bit less bass and a little more gain, I think it really does sound a little more resolving, not as over sharpened as Balanced. And take a track like Rebecca Pigeon's Spanish Harlem. It's a track that I've heard on 100 different sets, and it's a pretty good determination, especially if you're a hobbyist, of hearing the difference between high res and balanced, what's missing from balanced versus what you get in high res. That one really that track especially kind of stuck out to me, and where, especially if you've heard it on a more expensive set and you know what it's supposed to sound like, you'll sort of realize that CRA and balanced are kind of missing a little bit there, even though CRA has tons of speed and detail, not quite in the small details on a track like that, and that the room acoustics are especially missing on balanced on this one. So treble, like I said, I would consider it a little more lower and upper balanced for me. Some people who like CRA, and especially at lower volumes, you're probably not going to agree with that, but I think for me it just worked better that way. Definitely less fatiguing. Doesn't have that CRA mega treble from CRA, but overall it's just an easier to listen to, more natural sound to me. That's probably because I listen to it at slightly higher volumes than the general population who loved CRA. I think tend to listen to it at a lower volume, and I think it does sound pretty good there. But as you crank it up a little bit, it does become a little less natural and a little bit more fatiguing. So stage-wise, like I said, it's not quite the same as balanced, and certainly if you're a hobbyist, it's sort of an interesting exercise to listen to the stage on balanced and compare it to what you're hearing on high res. Like high res, I would think it's almost a more traditional stage where it's actually quite wide, and it does have some height, and it's got a very natural height to it for me, whereas balanced, there's a gap to it. So balanced would have instruments down below, and the higher instruments would pop up quite high. So like I said, it was quite tall and a bit unnatural, and I think there's just a little more naturalness to the stage on high res. And again, when you think of all the things together, high res became my favorite because I think it just did each one of these things slightly better than what balanced did, and I wasn't a fan of bass. So yeah, definitely high res was my favorite of the trio. And so if you get it, don't assume the high res is some super treble set and it's going to rip your ears off. It is not that. So do give a fair share of time to high res and listen for those details because they are there, and interesting set if you have all three. So do take that into consideration. Also remember the CRA Plus is around the corner, so you may want to wait a week or two and see how that pans out before jumping into the trio. So again, thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time.